Well, good afternoon, good evening from a pretty gloomy day here at Duke and Durham. We're thrilled to see so many of you here at our first AGS event of the new semester, and we want to welcome all the students back to school and other faculty, our alumni, to a terrific event, of course, extremely timely that we have today. Talking about foreign policy challenges facing the new Biden administration. We are especially lucky and thrilled to have two experts to inform us and educate us today. They need no introduction, and their bios are in the event materials, but we have our visiting Rubenstein Fellow, Susan Gordon, who has a long distinguished career in the intelligence community and most recently was the Principal Deputy Director for National Intelligence, and has been here at Duke for last semester and is teaching at Stanford this semester, and we're thrilled to have her. Welcome, Sue.
Glad to be here, and welcome to my students. This is just a fantastic topic in a remarkable time. It is just a remarkable time in the world.
It really is. And then somebody who really needs no introduction, our community is so familiar with him, Professor Bruce Jentleson, government servant, policy analyst, professor, renowned scholar, and most importantly at the moment, father to Adam Jentleson, the author of a terrific book on the Senate filibuster that's rocketing up the charts on Amazon called The Kill Switch. And Bruce, we're thrilled to have you with us this afternoon.
Well, thanks, David, and thanks for not having me do the commercial for Adam's book, but it's hard to miss him on TV. It's a really fascinating book about how the Senate works that I recommend with my professor's hat on, not just my dad hat on. But anyway, it's good to be with AGS, and hi to Beth and Bo and everybody affiliated with AGS.
Well, let's not waste any time and let's dive in. Tonight's event is on foreign policy, but really this is our first event of the year. And of course, it's been a tumultuous month in American governance and American constitutional history. And I think I'd be remiss if I really didn't focus a bit, at least at the outset, on both the unprecedented challenge, political challenge to the election results, and then the ensuing riot at the Capitol on the 1st of January. I'm sorry, on the 6th of January. And there is a connection to foreign policy. I think both of you would agree in that how this event was absorbed abroad, how it's affecting our soft power, the views of our allies, what it says about American democracy affects foreign policy and the ability of the new administration to move forward. So before we dive into foreign policy, I want to give both of you a chance to opine on what do you think is the meaning of the Capitol attack and the events that led up to it, and how are the internal challenges to our own democracy is facing, how does that complicate the beginning of the Biden administration and executing its goals in foreign affairs? Bruce, why don't you just start us off?
Sure. I've had the privilege of working for two different senators as a foreign policy advisor, actually one Republican, one Democrat earlier in my career. So I spent a lot of time in those buildings. David, I know you did as well. And Sue, I'm sure you were in and out of those buildings more times than any of us can count. I think we just have to call it what it was. It wasn't a riot. It was an insurrection, and it's a manifestation of domestic terrorism. And it wasn't just January 6th, as if January 6th is not enough. But you think about the things we've been seeing recently, plot to kidnap the governor of Michigan. The same day as January 6th, the former head of the KKK looking for the Georgia Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, in the Georgia State Capitol building. And these things go back further. They precede Donald Trump. No question, he accentuated them. They will be here after. But if people want to really read about this or follow it, one of the people who I recommend that you follow on Twitter and you read her work is a historian at the University of Chicago named Kathleen Belew, B-E-L-E-W. And she wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post recently, co-authored it, and really traces back to white power movements going back to the 1980s. and talks about efforts at assassination and kidnappings of political enemies, of federal judges and state troopers, of bombings of synagogues and infrastructure targets, sustained campaigns of harassment and terror against communities of color, and obtaining and training with stolen military weapons and explosives. The Biden administration has said this is a priority. The Director of National Intelligence is going to do a comprehensive look at this. The NSC is being staffed out, in fact, across. And the last point I'll make is it's not just a soft power issue. Think about it. After 9/11, our NATO allies invoked Article 5, the collective security element of the NATO treaty. We always thought we would invoke it to help them. They did it to help us. This time around, not only do we get expressions of sympathy, but as the German foreign minister put it, quote, "The enemies of democracy will be happy to see these incredible pictures from Washington, D.C." And he didn't mean Russia and China. He meant the right-wing similar movements all over Europe. So it's not just our soft power, but in many ways, that's a way in which we're becoming a problem in those ways for our allies, countries that we're supposed to be working with and trying to protect.
Well, thanks so much for that, Bruce. I will add my name to someone who's been thinking about this for a while. You'll note a 2015 op-ed in the New York Times called "The Growing Right-Wing Terrorism Threat." So yes, this has been a problem that's been apparent to many for a long time. Sue, our adversaries, for many decades, and this in terms of their own propaganda, they're always trying to dump on America, American democracy, America's lack of hypocrisy, lack of commitment to its ideals. How do you see this kind of playing into our adversaries and their anti-American strategy?
So I think we gave it to them. All they had to do is turn on the news, watch the TV, and basically we gave them data. Now they can change the soundtrack, but we gave them data to suggest that what they had been saying is true. I think the other thing is some of them are exacerbating it. And I've talked about this before with election security. Soviet doctrine for as long as I've studied was to undermine democracy. And now they have this cool tool of technology and digital connectedness that allows them to operate at speed and volume and relative stealth. And so exacerbating those rifts, I think, is something that they want to do. The impact of this is exactly what Bruce says, but I'll say one more, and that is the notion of loss of U.S. leadership is incredibly impactful worldwide on myriad issues. And it isn't just our financial contribution to it, it's our presence and our moral leadership. And we have lost some of that moral authority. So I think that's one of the problems. On the issue of domestic terrorism and extremism, I think we're going to have to look at this almost as we did post 9/11 in terms of how we're going to address it. There are not the structures in place to naturally go against this. I know the DNI said she was going to promise she'd take a look at it. There are real authorities issues when you have the U.S. intelligence community looking at domestic issues. And you have FBI and DHS in the lead. FBI has law enforcement as an issue. They look at things to be able to prove them. They are not as anticipatory in craft, so their skill isn't the same. And DHS, while it has the remit, it doesn't have the culture. So I think the Biden administration is going to have to put something together in order to really think about how we address this, because there are some natural disadvantages that our system has in terms of combating it.
Right, and some of those are embedded in the Constitution, which is a good thing. It requires some deep thinking. Let's, as we turn to foreign policy, before we look forward, I think we can't just forget or erase the foreign policy legacy of the Trump administration and just assume everything is going to turn back. So I wanted to give you both a chance to comment a little bit about some of the trends and things that we saw over the past 4 years. President Trump was really a historically unconventional president, and a lot of his foreign policies were, such a sharp departure from traditional bipartisan U.S. foreign policy. There's always disagreement on foreign policy, but Trump departed from kind of tradition and more so than any modern president. Yet I would assert that he was reflecting the views of many Americans who don't support lots of our military entanglements abroad, who were suspicious that our allies were taking advantage of us and taking much more than they were giving. People who want very sharp reductions in immigration, and also saw that the international trade system was really affecting their lives in a negative way and wanted to see radical change in our international trade posture. So his foreign policies were Trumpian, but they were also responding to demands or desires of at least a chunk of the US population. So I want to give you both a chance to both assess President Trump's approach to foreign policy and the key themes that I think, and then ask you if you think that Biden is just going to return back to the pre-Trump traditional kind of U.S. foreign policy consensus, or is he going to, do you think, consider some of these critiques and that will maybe modify his general approach? I'll start with you again, Bruce.
Yeah, I know. I think you make a good point, David, about when people study public opinion, whether it's academics or pollsters, they differentiate between just what the general polls show, what percentage of people, take what position or not on an issue, and the salience of those views. And the salience of those views gets you at how likely they are to vote on that basis. So those that supported Trump in 2016 were more foreign policy motivated, whether it was their version of trade policy or America First. And so there was an element in the country that felt that way. When you did polling, I work with the Chicago Council of Global Affairs. We do a lot of foreign policy polling. And they differentiated between Trump Republicans and non-Trump Republicans. And the non-Trump Republicans were still more sort of in the center. But I actually think that to me, the greatest damage for Trump, and this actually relates to the second part of your question, because I don't think there's any going back to the way things were to some sort of a pre-Trump playbook, is, the United States, we as a people, we're sort of used to, for much of our history, we kind of thought we were apart from the world, not totally isolationist in the 19th and early 20th centuries, but kind of picking and choosing when we'd get involved, like during world wars. And then after 1945, we largely sort of sat atop the world, right? Diplomatically, ideologically, technologically, militarily. And we've really entered an era, we haven't entered it for a long time, where we're kind of amidst the world. We shape it and it shapes us. It's what terrorism is about. It's what climate change is about, a whole variety of issues. And that's complicated for people. And I think Trump played on that and made people sort of want to resent the outside world and lash out of it. And at the end of the day, even if we had perfect policies at home, whether it was on counterterrorism or on climate change or on pandemics, you can't solve any problems in the world without working with others. And that's just a simple reality of it. Now, in relation to that, one last point, I'll pass the baton. This foreign policy consensus that you're referring to was not really, it was being frayed well before Donald Trump. I worked in the Obama administration, and it wasn't like our allies did everything we wanted them to do. Pakistan wouldn't tell us where bin Laden was. The Israelis worked against the Iran treaty. The Saudis didn't do what we wanted them to do. The Bush administration didn't exactly get support around the world for the Iraq war. And so this notion of somehow America as the single leader, it really fit an earlier era. And we're going to have to figure out what our role is. What does leadership mean in this third decade of the 21st century? And it's not what Trump did, but it's also not what we sort of comfortably tell us the world used to be like.
Thanks, Bruce. Sue?
Well, that was a great statement. Let me build off a couple. Number one, former President Trump was a disruptor at a disrupted time. This global connectedness, we had not adjusted well to it. I saw the rise of what I'll call pesky sovereignty that Bruce mentioned, where just countries deciding to go their own way. And that whether it is because they have power, their aspirations, whether it's because an economic growth. I think there are a lot of things that we need to look at about why that's so, but it is certainly true, and he comes into that. My experience with the president, just a couple things about him that I think shaped his foreign policy, in addition to what Bruce said. Number one is he had no foundation in terms of the framework of national security or bureaucracies, didn't really know what to do with them. If you remember a couple of his first acts, do y'all remember what his first act, and he was president-elect at the time? He wanted to take the call from a congratulatory call from the president of Taiwan. And the national security establishment said, oh my gosh, if you do, the free world will end, the one China policy will be gone, you may not. And he did, and the free world didn't end. And so he learns early on, he doesn't have an understanding of what it is. It feels negative to him. With that and the move of the embassy in Jerusalem, to Jerusalem, again, the national security community says, the free world will end. Again, it doesn't at the time. So he's getting emboldened, but without a foundation. Unlike so many of his predecessors, he is disproportionately economic in his worldview, not political, military. So all those entanglements we had that make sense from a strategic perspective do not. He looked at the world in terms of in relationships, in terms of leverage. What can I leverage? And so we're thinking that these are long-standing relationships, second and third order effects, and he views it as much more transactional. And then the last thing is because the establishment and he are so disconnected, the more decisions he makes without the support of the National Security Council process, the more disconnected he is from all the people that actually do the backbreaking physical work with our allies, right? And so you have lost the great connective tissue that makes things happen therein.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm going to turn to you again, Sue, on this question. Of course, any discussion of foreign policy really has to start with China. That relationship, whether we want it or not, is really going to dominate our next couple decades, whether it's on security, economics, trade, health, you name it. And first, I'd like you to kind of help us with the landscape and think about what are the relative strengths and weaknesses both parties are bringing to this relationship, as Bruce mentioned, the beginning of the third decade of the 21st century. Sometimes we use the analogy, who's playing the better hand right now? But I think if we're realistic, this is a sophisticated card game, maybe like bridge, not gin rummy. And it's not different, one side might have strengths in some areas and weaknesses in others. So this is a sophisticated analysis. Let's start there. How do you see the U.S. China relationship, and what are the strengths and weaknesses that both sides are kind of bringing to the table right now? Sue, go ahead. You can start on this one. Do we have a problem? Is Sue frozen, or did you hear me? Bruce, did you hear my question? Why don't you start off on?
I can hear you.
Okay.
Sue, are you okay? Or okay. Yeah, so I actually, let me take a little bit of issue with the premise of the question.
Sure.
In a couple respects. There is this sort of, great power competition view that's, fairly widely held now, but it's not necessarily one that I really hold. And a couple of things. One, before we get into the issue, and there are no question there are issues with China, but I want to kind of put it in perspective. So when we look at the world today, it kind of follows on a little bit what we were saying before. This is a world in which countries around the world are not interested in signing up with one team or the other. It's not like the Cold War and us and the Soviets. When you look at India right now, that's had military clashes with China in the Himalayas, is negotiating with China. They're actually negotiating with China, also with Russia involved. They also want to work with us. South Korea and Japan, continue to hold summits with China as well as with us. Countries like Israel and Saudi Arabia, who couldn't have gotten anything more from the Trump administration, have been pursuing relations with China that are not necessarily ones we want them to. It's a world in which countries want to have this pluralization of diplomacy, which essentially means that it's not one or the other of us is going to dominate the world. So as we think about the challenges for China, we have to do it in a way. This is sort of another point where I really worry a lot, given the history of American foreign policy. We've made some of our greatest mistakes by overestimating and misestimating threats. We did that all over the so-called Third World in the Cold War. We did it with Iraq. And so if we're going to get the China threat right, we're going to have to be wary about overestimating it. And countries in the Pacific, for example, I spent a lot of time in Australia before this. They have issues with China, but they don't want to have to choose between us and China. And then the last point about the center of American foreign policy, we're a grand strategy program. Well, when you think about grand strategy, you got to think about three things. You got to assess threats. You got to decide how viable the strategy is. And third, you got to decide whether it has domestic political support. I would submit on all three counts that pandemic prevention and climate change are far more threatening to Americans than anything China can possibly do. We've lost more people for this pandemic than during World War II. We still don't have it under control, and it's not if, but when the next one comes. We know the data on climate change. President Biden has rejoined Paris. If every country had met its Paris commitments, not just us, but the others, it would only be 50% of what's needed. So those issues can't stay at the periphery. We kind of get to them after we do the big guys, Russia and China. We have to have a proportionality here, and we absolutely have to deal with China. But I would like to see an American foreign policy which actually gives even higher priority to pandemic prevention and to climate change, because those things affect Americans more, and it affects the economy more, and it affects the future more.
Sue,
I'm back.
Okay, sorry we missed
No,
you.
it's just
Giving you the chance to go first, but now that Bruce has kind of laid out the do we focus? Is our national discussion too China centric, or is this still a critically important relationship that needs to be a top focus of our national security and our foreign policy thinking?
Yeah, so I'll take where Bruce ended, and I'll pick up with him. I agree. If you look at the past with his last point about the range of focus areas we need, they can't just be China or Russia anymore. If you think about the great national security threats over the last 2 years, COVID, economy, climate, immigration, social unrest. I mean, these are big national security issues. Maybe they're not military national security issues if you think about it, but they are national security issues nonetheless, and we really need to focus on them. And when we focus on China particularly, but China and Russia, we need to think of them not as a great monolith of our past, but actually in terms of their involvement in the world and how you put them into this world in motion and how they are influencing that. I will say China's expansionism, whether that is economic to include what they're doing in terms of free markets, in terms of manipulating them, what they're doing with technology is really concerning. The result of that is they have a huge advantage in data and data use. They're equivalent in compute, and their opportunity to practice, because they don't have the same societal constraints on what they can use in terms of people's data, is something that is concerning. So in a world where the threats are to and through information, China is differently concerning because of their growing ability in that area. And then the second is their expansionism economically worldwide. Their moves into China and South America, they're offering real economic value, but it is coming with strings and it's in our back. So when we think about China, I would encourage us to think differently about the threats than kind of a Cold War version of these big nation states. But from my perspective, from an intelligence perspective, China is concerning because of how much its economic model is dependent on what it is doing in these areas that are concerning.
Well, let's talk about that from the perspective of the incoming or the current new administration in terms of Trump seemed to be aware, at least his trade advisors were very much aware of the China 2025, its advances on AI, and the bleed over of that into military capabilities as well. They were kind of torn because they wanted to sell a lot of U.S. soybeans and so on to China for domestic political purposes, and maybe took their eye off the ball a little bit. But how, would you recommend given that this is China's economic model and it is the technology of the future, and information and so on will have a lot to do with economic growth in the future. How would you be advising the Biden administration to kind of frame how it addresses that threat?
So I'm going to turn this over to Bruce pretty quickly to drinking his wisdom. But what I would say is I'm going to advocate that the Biden administration needs a third option. The Trump administration's view of not China, not Chinese students, not interacting with them, not allowing our companies to participate technologically. And the consequence of that is that you can't be global leaders. If not, that is not going to be a successful model. As a matter of fact, that kind of plays in because what you've taken is our natural strength of openness and competitiveness, and you've actually made it more restrictive. So I don't think you can continue on that path. But this notion of we're all friends and ignoring the fact of how they are using their power and their manipulation is something that has to be addressed. So I would say you have to be strong on China. You have to disallow the economic manipulation that they have used as a way of strength. You need to double down in terms of understanding how are they going to conduct warfare, because they have some pretty neat capabilities, but you have got to protect US interests by finding a way to protect technological advance while still competing in an open world.
Yeah, you could see how the not China just wasn't attractive to a lot of our allies on the whole Huawei 5G issue.
And they couldn't do it. I mean, ultimately the UK came around, but I will tell you, states in the United States who are in disadvantaged areas that wanted to deliver on the promise of broadband in order to change the economic and the educational opportunities had to choose Huawei because it was the only economically viable thing. So you have to stop the economic mischief, but not China. Is just not a sustainable strategy.
Bruce, you want to dive on it before we turn to another topic?
Sure. No, I was making some really good points. It reminds me of the British case on Huawei, right? In which the British had, despite the relationship with Trump, they said they were going to go ahead with Huawei. And then they changed, not so much over Huawei, but over Hong Kong, right? China keeps overplaying its hand and suffering some consequences, right? Its crackdown on Hong Kong, is a concern to everybody, but particularly the British, given history. Similarly with COVID, I mean, it's not the Wuhan virus or the China virus, and we are responsible for the way we have mishandled this, such that we have 4% of the world population and 22%, of the deaths. But it was really because of the way Trump handled it that China didn't suffer as much for the way it handled the early phases, right? And so they play on our mistakes, and so we can play on their vulnerabilities as they expand the Belt and Road Initiative. They're starting to find out what we found out, when we were in imperial power, what the Soviets found out, what the Europeans found out before that, is people push back, right? And they're getting pushbacks on the terms of the Belt and Road Initiative from a number of countries that said, oh, we kind of wanted your money, but we don't want you to call the shots here. Maybe on issues that are important to you, not important to us, like say Taiwan, but not to the point of domination. And so there's a lot the United States can work with if we're savvy and strategic. Some of that's military, some of that's intelligence, and some of that is just savvy diplomacy rather than, rushing out and thinking that we've got to go back to, sort of Cold War strategies. They don't really fit this situation. We got to be, savvier and more strategic than that.
All right, I want to spin to another part of the globe, another issue that has been subject with a lot of discussion and speculation is our relationship with Iran. I think rejoining the Paris Accords was a no-brainer and very easy because the main structure of the accords remained in place, and the situation that drove them is getting even more dire. So rejoining was in a way easy. But when we look at the Iran nuclear deal, a lot has changed, the land since 2015. So kind of just simply flicking the switch and say, oh, we'll just pretend this didn't happen and go back to the way things were is tricky, difficult. So when we deal with Iran, let me start with a foundational question and we'll get into more details. But it seems to me that the strategy of the Obama administration, correct me if either of you have a different view, was that let's deal with the nuclear issues. And if we can deal with nuclear issues, it will be a lot easier to deal with all the other issues we have with Iran relating to its behavior. Support for terrorism, its missile program, its regional aggression, its support for terrorist groups, and so on. And indeed, the critics hated that. They hated the deal because it didn't deal with all of these issues at once. And so I guess my first question about Iran is this a possible approach? Do you think the Biden administration could or should try to bifurcate these issues and get the nuclear program back under some sort of international framework and then deal with the other issues? Or is its approach to Iran going to have to be integrated?
David, I think you
David,
got
everybody
muted.
just got muted. You just got muted too.
Yeah, Bruce, he wants to increase the level of difficulty of our answers by not giving us the back half
Yeah.
of this question.
If somebody's hacking us, but everybody got muted at once. Yeah.
I think what
Are
he
you
said
back
is,
on?
Bruce, you go first and you answer the question of, does the Biden administration have to continue the policy of bifurcating the nuclear from the non-nuclear issues, or is there a different approach?
Yeah, in 2015, there was really very little discussion about, solving everything at once. I actually chaired one of Hillary Clinton's working groups in the 2016 campaign. And we were having discussions, just saying you can't just build a one-legged stool, right? With the Soviet Union, the Cold War, we started with arms control, and we had to build on that. And there was an awareness of it that, like David was saying, you're going to have to find some way of dealing with regional issues and regional rivalries, not necessarily solving them all, but getting some sort of handle on them and reducing the tensions. Now, I think, as David was saying, I mean, we're 5 years into the deal. It had a time frame on it. And so rejoining it, even if everybody agreed tomorrow, the time frame on the deal is closer than it was. And we lost that 4 years of building out the relationship or extending the deal. It is a first step. And I have to say, if an Iranian official said, how do I know that in 2022 you won't lose control of Congress, and 2024 you'll be out? I'm a little leery about making a commitment, that would sort of be understandable. So there's a lot of work to be done. I think absolutely the Europeans, the Russians, and the Chinese, we need to work with them because we do not have the credibility on our own. And we do need to move these other issues. And the way to do it is not just to build this anti-Iran coalition, which involves our relationship with Saudi Arabia, which to me is one of the most problematic relationships we've had for a long time, and particularly in the Trump years. But we're going to have to get a handle on those. And Sue probably has more expertise in the technical details of the nuclear issue than I do. But that has to be a first step, and it has to lead to the other steps fairly quickly.
Yeah, you have to deal with the issue of a nuclear Iran, right? I mean, that is much like North Korea. Those are two issues that they cannot be allowed to acquire nuclear weapons, not just in terms of what it does in regional stability, but in terms of sales. So that issue has to maintain. What had happened in the years since the agreement was Iran's rise as a regional power. They were well resourced. They were getting money from what we had put in, and they were regionally incredibly maligned, not just in their proxy fighting, but their insinuation into the cultures. What they were doing in Iraq in terms of moving in and taking over cultural leads was really concerning. I think one of the things that was so difficult about that is you simultaneously have a Trump strategy wanting to get out of the Middle East, and you have this resurgent power. And so I think that was one of the things they had to deal with. I think the Biden administration will have to deal with that as well. I will tell you, the economy is bereft. And one of the most difficult things about the Trump policy was it is so bereft, it is pretty hard for moderates to be able to seize onto something. In other words, there's that old adage that they say is, unless you're close together, you can't come to any truce, because the person that's way ahead will never agree to a lesser position, and the person that is really in trouble will never agree to stay there. And so that's one of the things they're going to have to deal with, is just how bereft they are. And then the last point is to the whole of what we've been talking about today with the connectedness of the world. What we learned when we pulled out of JCPOA is just how important that agreement was to Europe. And so this is not a time where you can have the U.S. unilaterally take a lead. This is going to have to be a set of partners. So Biden administration, again, has their hands full on this one, but I don't think you can separate the two. We've seen the effect when they're together, when they're not.
David, let me make one other point on this, picking up on what Sue said. The Obama administration used some pretty severe economic sanctions, but they linked it to diplomacy. Trump called his maximum pressure, like, we're going to squeeze you till you say uncle. And as Sue said, the economic hit on the Iranian economy has been enormous. But countries don't say uncle. Converting economic impact to policy change doesn't happen by, and it, you can study almost any case of economic sanctions and you see this, right? And so whatever economic levers we have, both in carrots and sticks, is going to we have to link to diplomacy. Repression in Iran has gotten worse in the Trump years. Some notion that you're going to have this magical regime change and the son of the Shah is going to come back. And so that's part of the strategy, is not just let's hit them harder and impose punishments. Let's figure out a way to link that to a diplomatic process. And I do think that this is one in which it's not, the United States needs to be supportive, but it also could be a common ground with the Russians and the Chinese again. I think they still have interest in a non-nuclear Iran.
But the way this is played out, unlike a normal negotiation where you're kind of at least starting from someplace, this thing has a history now, and it's going to be hard for Iran, won't it, to agree to some deal that constrains them more than the prior deal did? Isn't that a real challenge for the negotiators?
They're in a worse position. I mean, though they have a significant threat to hold over the heads, and that is the restarting of a nuclear program, or the starting of a nuclear program. And we could talk about where it really is. They are in a worse position. And they're not only just a worse position economically, but a worse position societally. After the killing of Soleimani, you have seen significant unrest in their populace. And when they shot down the Russian airliner, the population turned on the government. So I think that they are in a bit of a worse position. But this is where you tell Tony Blinken to make his money and get that diplomacy thing going. But I do think Iran's in a worse position. I don't think they can just force their way back to the one they had before. I just don't think they have the legs to do that.
All right, well, I want to start to turn to questions from the audience. I think many of you have been given instructions on sending a chat to Bo Carlson if you would like to ask a question. Before we get to that, let me make some pitches for some upcoming events. On February 3rd, I think that's next Wednesday, we're going to be hosting Brad Wigman from the former Deputy Assistant Attorney General for National Security. He's a big Duke alum and was actually a direct colleague of mine. We both worked together in the Department of Defense General Counsel's office. And the focus there is going to be technology, foreign policy, national security, which is the name of the course that or close to the name of the course I'm teaching this semester. So we're really looking forward to having Brad next Wednesday. And then we're going to have on February 23rd, we're co-sponsoring an event with the Duke Alumni Affairs, which is kind of a follow-up on today's discussion, which is about the first 100 days. That won't be quite 100 days, so I don't know why we're doing it, but calling it that. But the first month in office for the Biden administration. Let's see, Bo, do we have, let's see, I'm pulling up the chat. Do we have folks who are ready to ask a question?
We do. Jessica Jordan, I'll go ahead and unmute her, and she has our first question.
Great. Go ahead, Jessica.
Hi, sorry for the tech delay there. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate tonight's insightful and timely discussion. I'm a UNC alumna. I'm thrilled to continue to engage in AGS programming through this remote platform as I'm now up in Massachusetts. My question to the panel is, how would you construct the current hierarchy of US vital national interests? And I've read with interest Graham Allison and the Commission on America's National Interests sort of blueprint published a number of years ago, in which 5 interests were flagged as vital: nuclear, biological, chemical weapons attacks, preventing the emergence of a hostile hegemony in Europe or Asia, preventing, catastrophic collapse of major global trade systems, as we've discussed tonight, and ensuring the survival of the United States and its allies. And I'm curious, what does that vital national interest sort of hierarchy look like in today's world? What would you prioritize?
So you want to go first, or?
Yeah, I'll be a warm-up act for you, and you can fix it for me, Bruce. I am absolutely seized with what's going on in America right now in terms of our belief in ourselves, and I don't have a more clever way to say that. But I think that is our primary national interest at the moment, is getting ourselves focused on that, and as a corollary, the whole notion of trust and truth. We are really struggling globally with what to believe, with disinformation and the deleterious effect that that is having on societies. It is contributory to the rise of populism that's causing a lot of things. So I think I would probably choose that as the most immediate. And then I'd probably go back with Graham and I'd choose some of the hardy perennials. COVID has shown exactly how dependent we are on each other in decision making. So I probably put that right up there as second. And there are a whole bunch of secondary issues about supply chain security, the choices that our private sector are making. They're turning out to be decision makers on that. And then I'll run down the list that I have before. Certainly climate is there. We have always known the ecosystem around climate problems, but this past year was the first time it really manifested in a way that is significant. I'll put China still in the mix there, and then nuclear is always, a foundational concern because of its devastating effect. And we are so far past my youth when we did duck and cover drills because we thought that threat was here, that I think sometimes we forget that that's there. So, but I'm going to start with our own societal unrest and extremism, not only here, but globally.
Yeah, before I actually get into that, let me just mention, I saw that I think Beth or Bo put other events in the chat. If you guys could add the February 17th event with Kim Gaddis, who's the author of this absolutely, truly insightful book on the Middle East. Kim was a Lebanese-British journalist. She worked for BBC. I worked with her some when I was at the State Department in the early Obama administration. It's called Black Wave, and it gives you insights into what goes on in the Middle East that you just don't get from American think tanks or others. I think that's a noon one given Beirut time, but well, I'm thinking about the Middle East. Yeah, I would say so students in my class on Politics, Foreign Policy, I actually show them the old duck and cover cartoon that I used to see, and so you'll be getting that, students, in a couple of weeks, about what we had to do when we were in grade school for somehow protecting from nuclear war under my desk in suburban New York, but more to come. So I guess I would come back to, all these issues are important. You mentioned Graham and others' work on weapons of mass destruction, so, which we always refer to as WMD. Well, if you think about the pandemic, we're dealing with DMD, diseases of mass destruction. And you think about climate change, it's environmental mass destruction, and those aren't exaggerations or rhetoric now. You look at the data on them. 400,000 people died in 2018, deaths around the world affected by climate change, 18,000 from terrorism. Wall Street has actually got it, right? All these investment firms are shifting to sustainable investment and the like. So I actually think, and I'll do my own little commercial. I happen to have a reprint here of the article that I wrote last fall in Washington Quarterly called Refocusing U.S. Grand Strategy on Pandemic and Environmental Mass Destruction. And I make a very detailed grand strategy argument there, comparing it to China and Russia. Not that those other issues aren't important, but if you take grand strategy seriously, you have to prioritize. And if you think about pandemics, like Sue was saying about supply chains, that gets into the China issue. Supply chain, PPE, why were they all over there? Well, it had something to do with not using the Defense Production Act, with the incentives for our private sector to go where labor was the cheapest. So there are a lot of aspects of this that feed into the China and the other kinds of issues. But those really, that and also what we started with is domestic terrorism. We, not just soft power, but the threats to our democracy are so profound. And frankly, they're so well armed out there that there's a reason why that's being put into, and I think Sue's points about getting the intelligence community involved in domestic is very tricky from civil liberties and a legal point of view. But we have to be able to fight our differences in nonviolent ways that respects the norms and institutions of democracy. So that doesn't crowd out the others. But we foreign policy people have to be thinking about that too.
I think that having a grand strategy question right out of the gate would warm Professor Fever's heart. But I will remark at how different Jessica's list was from the list that our panelists, which we could have a healthy debate with Professor Fever when next time he's with us. Anyway, our next question is from Oliver Pittet.
Hi, good evening, and thank you for taking my question. My question tonight for the panel is, what role do you see the military playing in Biden's administration foreign policy agenda? And specifically, do you anticipate the military playing a reduced or significant different role in geographic regions where China and the United States are in economic competition? Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. I think it's noticeable that when President Biden finishes his speech, he always says, "And God bless our troops." He has been a long history with the role of the American military, and I think he gets it in terms of his respect for the military. My own sense is we are going to see some version of winding down the two longest wars in history. We can get into the details of what that means, but I think that it's more than time for that. But on your question about Asia, let me just focus on that for a second. Our traditional doctrine militarily in Asia and now called the Indo-Pacific was to maintain military preponderance in the region. I don't think that creates stability anymore. I don't think that's something that China will live with. I think that will contribute to instability. We don't want Chinese preponderance and Chinese intimidation through South China Sea Islands and others of our allies. But I think the goal there is going to be what we call during the détente period, essential equivalence, where neither side has that kind of dominance. That means there's a military role in that, but some of the proposals being made for ratcheting it up, some of the most significant things happening militarily are not just the Quad, which bring us, Japan, Australia, and India together, but military exercise that those three countries have been having together. I think that's great. They're playing an active role that isn't necessarily, it complements ours, but isn't necessarily just about us and China. And so I think the military is a part of it, but I do not see this as primarily a question of ratcheting up deterrence in the region. I think that is that risks more instability, not less.
Yeah, I think great question, Oliver, and good points. A couple adds. Number one is when I look at the national security appointees, this is a calm the water group. This is a reestablish partnerships, reestablish morale, get it on an even keel. I don't think that you're going to see the military industrial complex just swing into action. I think this is going to be exactly what Bruce says, more likely. I do think that you will see, particularly the DoD, get seriously into some of these issues related to COVID and climate. And that is what we learned in these experiences is that there was a huge disconnect between the perspective and the wherewithal of the federal government, and we were throwing it over the transom to local and state who were wholly unprepared to do things. So you're going to see a little bit of that. Two things that they will have to address. Number one, got to turn to on cyber. And whether that is cyber resilience or whether that is deterrence, we kind of got to get this one squared away. We're losing what we're losing in terms of intellectual property and treasure is massive. And then the last is, I think you're going to see continued use of what you see in Africa and what Bruce mentioned, where use of our allies. You know, our presence in Africa is disproportionately leveraged by the French and others. We are not the big player there, even though it is a very effective force. So I think you'll see continuation of that.
Let me ask a more pointed question about the issue Bruce, deferred a little bit on, which is Afghanistan. Two presidents, our two most recent presidents, want to get out of Afghanistan, and definitely got a lot of pushback from the DoD and also I think from the intelligence community. So what's the right approach here? One that balances both counterterrorism and our desire, as Bruce said, to end the longest war in U.S. history.
Yeah, and with all due respect to our colleagues who've served there in Iraq as well, but in Afghanistan and have risked their lives, both military and civilian, NGOs and others. After 20 years, I'm very unconvinced that it's just a question of troop levels going forward, right? So I've been critical of other administrations. In 2009, when the Obama administration did its Afghan review, I was not a part of that, but one of the flaws in that was it was all about three different proposals for levels of troops. Vice President Biden was actually at the lower level, and the question at the time, this was one of those issues that brought together Henry Kissinger and Dick Holbrooke. Kissinger had long been saying that what you need here, is not just a question of your troop levels, but you need, a regional strategic diplomacy strategy. The reality is that so many other countries in the region, Pakistan, India, China, Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, have known they could mess around there and choose their favorite group. And we kind of bear the burden, right? Because if they cause instability, it's our forces that are there. And you really needed to have a diplomatic initiative along with what, as you began to withdraw your troops, that would basically say, guys, you keep doing that, we're not going to be there to give you a little security blanket, and good luck trying to prevail. Talk to the Soviets, talk to Gorbachev, talk to the British, talk to us. And you begin to have some sense of a degree of, coordination among the major powers that goes along with what you're trying to do inside the country. But you do that by starting to get out. You can't make it when conditions are ready, because I don't think they're ever going to be there after 20 years. So I would be clear about getting out, but I would also combine it with a serious diplomatic initiative, because everybody ends up with nobody will get their first choice option, but maybe people can get their second or third rather than their 17th option for their own sense of their national interests.
Incredibly well said. It shouldn't just be about troop levels. We have started a peace process, and the administration is going to have to figure out what to do with it, whether there's a chance for peace. There have been agreements made with the Taliban in terms of what their actions must be in order for us to continue to withdraw. They haven't been doing that, and so we'll have to act on it. 2 points that Bruce said that I think are necessary. Number one is you do have to even if you are getting out, you have to do it in a meaningful way, because there are a lot of our allies and partners that are there who have done work with us, and they are there because we asked them. And so a precipitous withdrawal, like the former president was talking about, would have been really disastrous on that. We have never had a good regional strategy. The only way forward is a serious regional strategy with the players. Neatly enough, almost everyone's best interest is for a stable, peaceful Afghanistan. So you ought to be able to find it. But much as we said with Iran, I don't think this can be US led. it must be US participated in, but I don't think we can lead it. I think maybe it's a UN special council or something, but got to have a regional strategy.
All right, we have Deborah Aids, and we'll try to do one answer per question, and we'll alternate between the two of you so we can squeeze in more students. Go ahead, Deborah.
Hi, I'm a sophomore studying public policy and history, and I was wondering what your thoughts are on how the Biden administration is going to navigate the Israeli-Palestine situation in the wake of Trump's pretty unilateral support for Netanyahu in Israel.
Let's go to Bruce on this one. We'll get Sue on the next one.
Yeah, I've worked this issue a lot in government and outside, and I think, Secretary Designate Blinken, I think in his testimony, had said they're not going to move the embassy back out of Jerusalem, but they are going to strongly oppose any efforts at annexation. And I think they need to oppose, the sort of the somewhat Netanyahu clever expansion of settlements without really calling it expansion. Right now, I think there are a couple of things. One is the parties aren't ready. The United States can never want peace more than the parties do. And the Netanyahu government and the whole demographics of Israeli politics, the groups that are to his right and the Palestinians, aren't really ready to make a deal. So I think the notion of some big initiative to get to a deal, I think you try to not to make the problem worse. But I think one of the things they will do, two things. One is begin aid, USAID and other programs to the Israeli Arabs and to the Palestinians in the territories. Those policies of Trump that were, cutting off UN programs, sure, they weren't perfect. Whether it's humanitarian or strategic, they made no sense. And the second I think they'll do is get out of this notion that you can leave that conflict there and get this normalization of relations with Israel because everybody's against Iran. That's a trap for the United States. It's a trap the Saudis have played for a long time. So I think they're going to be a little bit more savvy about the kind of deals that they'll accept. Israel's having its third or fourth election in a year. So I think that's the realistic sense, that they'll do. Don't make the prospects for peace worse in a lot of ways, and make clear to the Israelis that some of the things that Trump was willing to support, this administration will not.
Okay, Peter Connolly, a question for Sue Gordon.
Hi, so thank you again for speaking with us today. My question is, with the threats posed by COVID-19 and climate change, it's really shown the need for multilateral institutions and international institutions that are strong with good alliances. How do you think Biden can kind of negotiate in good faith when a lot of foreign leaders know the strong kind of isolationist tendencies within American voters, and knowing that it could kind of swing back in 4 years if Biden doesn't run for re-election or doesn't win an election, and kind of how does he go about that negotiations?
That's a great question, and I think it goes to almost where we started, and that is, can you ever go back from the world seeing what happened here, right? And so will all our partners worry that is so? Couple things. One, I think this is something that the Biden administration is really good at. The team he's put in place are some really quite remarkable statesmen and women. And I expect this to be a very strong focus early on to build those relationships for that. The second thing I will tell you is almost every country, almost every democracy is struggling with the rise of populism as well. It is the same forces acting in their nation states. And so the solution space, I think, will include recognition of those tendencies because they're experiencing them as well. So actually, I think this will be a strong suit to try and build these coalitions. The question is, are you just going to have enough energy with all the other issues we're facing domestically, even though our domestic solutions depend on the international coalitions?
Okay, we now have Sam Jentleson.
Hi guys, thank you all for your insights tonight. The question I had was kind of based on some of the current things going on with China, and that Xi Jinping's statement today, kind of almost a warning against Biden and creating what he seems to want to be a grand alliance against China. And I know that both of your opinions are that maybe it shouldn't be the forefront foreign policy grand strategy concern, but it seems to be right now for the Biden administration. I'm wondering what you see as the future of this grand alliance that Biden wants to create, and what are some of the kind of roadblocks that might get in the way of that?
Yeah, I think you're overestimating. You know, again, he's made climate change a high priority, and he continues to say that he's spread it. It's not just a little compartment over here. I think he's navigating the China issue carefully, and all foreign leaders are putting out their positions now. You know, it is a game of chess, I think, as David said at the beginning. And I can tell you that India, Japan, South Korea, Australia, Europeans, they don't want a grand alliance against China. I mean, Europe, for example, have been negotiating a new trade and investment agreement with China, and they had some issues along the way. And during the transition, Jake Sullivan, who's a good friend of both of ours and I have great respect for, the incoming national security advisor, took to Twitter and put out a tweet to the Europeans saying, I really hope you'd leave this till we're in office. And they didn't, because they had interest. Now they're not going to China, it's to the United States. And so the United States has to really come around and find a balance between where are our shared interests in relation to China, and where do everybody have their own interests and are going to pursue them. And that's the geopolitical reality, and doesn't mean they're appeasers or anything like that. So an effort at a grand alliance is likely not only to be a problem with China, it's going to blow up in your face with your allies.
Okay, we have a question from Riley Nicholson.
Hi, yeah, I just have a quick question about Taiwan. So it appears China's not being shy about its intentions there. I believe they violated Taiwanese airspace on just day 3 of the Biden administration. Today, I think it was another 15 warplanes sent into Taiwan's airspace. So my question is just, where do you expect this is all going to lead? And what, if anything, does the Biden administration plan to do to protect Taiwan?
So I wish there were a short answer to that question. It's a great one. I think we're seeing exactly where China intends it to lead. They've made no bones about it, whether it is through coercion or cyber or overt military action. I think this will really test the Biden administration as they go down this path. The last thing they want to have to do is to step in there militarily in order to be able to fulfill their commitment to Taiwan. So I expect them to try and do what they can from a negotiation perspective to forestall that outcome, because that would be just, I can think of few powder keg actions that would be as distracting as that. And boy, that undermines the impact on the Taiwanese, but it would be incredibly distracting to this administration. So I expect them to turn to try and walk back some of the aggressive activities, just so it doesn't turn into a powder keg. But this is the kind of thing that we worry about when we always say what happens during transition, or what happened in the last few months of the Trump administration, when we seem scattered, when we don't seem like we are well organized or have a position well in hand. This is a good time for people to press their advantage to see what is what and how resolved we are. But this would be a rabbit hole to go down.
Okay, Jason Grill.
Hi, thank you all for being here. And Professor Gordon, I look forward to starting our course in earnest next week. But my question is, how do you think the US can reconcile Europe's legitimate energy needs, which have led them to pursuing Russian natural gas and their pretty significant interest in buying Iranian oil, which kind of coincide with China's similar interests in those kind of energy needs, with our desire to work with Europe against those same 3 countries in many situations?
Bruce, I think it's your turn.
This is me in the rotation. This is at least the 3rd Russian or Soviet natural gas pipeline these issues have been raised with. One was in the early 60s. It was an oil pipeline. In the early 80s, there was a natural gas pipeline that, by the way, even Margaret Thatcher wanted to go ahead with, even though she had this strong relation with Ronald Reagan, and this one. So a couple of things. One, the notion that the Russians will get leverage over the people on the other end has never happened before. And I don't think it will. I think the Europeans want to diversify their portfolio of energy suppliers, given the instabilities of the Middle East, number one, and by different types of energy, sustainable oil, gas, still a little bit of coal, nuclear in some countries. And again, it comes back to, when we were negotiating the JCPOA with Iran, and afterwards, part of the incentive was that countries could buy the Iranian oil. The part of the willingness of the Europeans to buy Iranian oil now is also saying we don't agree with Trump. He's, after all, the one that pulled out of the nuclear non-proliferation agreement first. And China's role in this is, China has its relations, again, this isn't a big gain for China. It makes Europe more stable. It fits their own economic interests. I think that the Russian pipeline may have problems now because of Navalny, because the Germans have been the most interested in this, and they're under a lot of pressure now because of, incident number 2 with Navalny now. And kind of like what I said about the Chinese in Hong Kong and the British in Huawei, they may be overplaying their hand, and the Germans may pull back from it for that reason. But the notion of sort of dependence that can be leveraged for foreign policy greatly overestimates the leverage that would come from this pipeline.
All right, I think we have time for, well, at least one more question. Elise Bosquet.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking with us tonight. It's been very insightful. I was wondering, is there anything that you think the Trump administration got right? Whether that be President Trump himself or his cabinet members? And is there anything that the Biden administration can learn from their shift in focus or a specific policy?
That's a great question, Elise. Let's see. I'll see if I can give a scorecard. I think the Trump administration got instantaneously China right, because something had to be able to stop the course they were on, and they've brought to light a lot of activities that, had they continued, they would be difficult, particularly in the information domain. You would have to say that the Middle East is a bit more peaceful than they were. The question is, and I actually, in a weird sort of way, Trump's legacy is entirely dependent on Biden, and can he take these actions and turn them into something sustainable? North Korea, it's still hanging out there, and the peace talks went exactly the way they thought they would go. On the other hand, they haven't tested a nuclear weapon or a nuclear device in 3 years, so that's better. Some of the actions on treaties with respect to Russia pulling out of the INF, it was a good move. That was being abrogated every day and was putting Europe at risk. Not a terrible plan to get NATO to commit to spend up to their 2%, not worth the total demoralization of that alliance. So those are a set of things that I think were useful. And the other thing is, and this is going to be controversial, and we can talk about it in our class and other things. From an intelligence officer's perspective, the world was demanding action. We had longstanding issues that had been languishing and getting worse. The structure of the National Security Council in previous administrations had been much more about meeting a lot, talking a lot, and not taking decided action. Then you whipsaw to the Trump administration and you do action with almost no foundation. But there are some issues that demand action. So what I would hope of the Biden administration is that they deal with the issues at hand, surely, stop trends that are deleterious in their effect, but do so with an understanding that this is a connected world, not only connected with their own bureaucracy, but with their partners and allies.
Bruce, do you want to add to that list or take issue with any things that the successes that Sue put on the list?
I can, but if you want to get that last question in, that's okay too.
Okay, yeah, let's do that. Becca Dudley.
See, it was Becca.
Hi there. Yeah, thanks so much for talking to us tonight. This has been really interesting. I know I've learned a lot, and I'm sure everyone else has as well. I would, Bruce, if you'd like to respond to what Sue said about her takes, I'd be interested to hear that answer. But I also wanted to hear your thoughts about one other issue that has been in the news recently, and that is Brexit. And the Trump administration obviously was much more supportive of Brexit than I imagine the Biden administration would be. But given that it has happened and is happening to mixed reviews and mixed successes across different industries, what do you think? What do you suspect the Biden administration will do, if anything, to show its support or opposition for this move that the United Kingdom has made? Thanks.
So I'll tell a quick story, Becca. I was in London in June 2016, scheduled to give a talk on how domestic politics were going to affect foreign policy at Chatham House, the Royal Institute of International Affairs, and 2 days before the Brexit vote happened. So I showed up for this talk, which was business people, diplomats, academics, and kind of said, do you want to hear me, or could you guys tell me what the heck's going on here? And by the way, the same week was when England lost to Iceland in the European Cup. And if you walked into a pub, it was hard to tell which one people were more upset over, the Brexit vote or losing the football game. But, I think while it was going on, I think the Trump administration was contributing to the problem by saying, go at it, I don't like the EU, right? It's a done deal now. I think it's pretty negative for Britain. And I think it will continue to be that way in a lot of ways. So I think the Biden administration now will try to say to Britain, okay, how do we work with you now that you've made your decision? You're not reversing it. You're no longer in a position to say we're going to help you get to that point. How do we cooperate? We are not going to get in the middle of trying to make it better for you between you and Brussels. That's not our role. And again, we would probably think it was a bad decision to start with. So it's a very different kind of set of issues. I don't think it's going to be that difficult a set of issues to handle now that the deal has been made for the United States. I think for Britain, it's enormously problematic in lots and lots of ways.
Well, we really have spanned the globe this evening, and we've talked about grand strategy and granular issues as well. So this has been a real tour de force. Thank you to both our guests. I miss my hallway conversations with Bruce Jentleson. I learn so much every time we bump into each other, and it's nice to be able to have an extended period. And Sue, we're really looking forward to having you as a colleague and hopefully having some in-person interactions, maybe outside once the weather gets a little nicer. But we're grateful to both of you for our contribution to our students and our grand strategy program. We really have, as Bruce mentioned, a load of interesting events that really will get us deeper into a lot of the discussions today. We really just began to scratch the surface. So please keep these events on your calendar and join us in the future. And let's please join me in giving both of our esteemed guests a virtual thank you and applause and so on. I'm seeing hand signs pop up all over. We had a wonderful audience of over 100 people today, so many thanks. I'm not surprised given our guests. And we're adjourned for the evening. Thank you so much again.
Thanks, David. Thanks, Sue, and thanks to AGS.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you also to Beth and Bo. We had some technical issues and an intruder. I apologize for that, but Bo and Beth are really on top of it and stem the damage. So thank you for that. And thank you for all the organizing that they do to make these things happen.
Great
Good
job.
night, everyone.
Bye-bye.